This takes courage to look inside ourselves, to admit that racism is a part of our lives, of our community, and of our culture. On Austin Faith Dialogue, I invite you to have that courage and come with me, and let's talk about racial reconciliation.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Welcome to Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Carl Gronberg, host for the program, and I'm glad you're with us. We're going to talk about a subject that's heavy because it asks us to do some introspection. It asks us to look at our community and those elements of life that divide us. And we have with us today on Austin Faith Dialogue Dr. Larry Bethune, pastor of University Baptist Church. Larry, thank you for being with us.
It's an honor to be here, Carl.
It's great to have you here. It takes courage. It takes courage on your part to be here, and the courage of a group of clergy in our community to talk about racial reconciliation. In many ways, it's a subject that we might want to talk about, put it aside, not deal with it. But a group of clergy in this community are talking about racial reconciliation. Why do we need to do that?
We need to talk about it because of the history of our people, because racism has been a part of American history and a part of the history of the church, particularly in our part of the country. We need to talk about it because racism still continues among us in a variety of levels. A lot of times when we think about racism, we think about the Klan or some kind of hate crimes or extreme acts of racism. And those need to be a matter of concern, but there are other kinds of racism which in some ways are more insidious because they're a part of the culture, a part of the society. We need to deal with this issue because we need to listen to the experiences of minority clergy who talk about the day-by-day experience of racism that their people have.
As fearful as this is, and how it demands courage, it's also exciting. It's exciting that there are clergy in this community, and this is a wonderful community where we live. But clergy in this community, you want to provide moral leadership for the community. Tell us about it. How did this clergy group get together, and why did they tackle the issue of racial reconciliation?
Several different groups went to Mayor Watson when he began serving his term, several different clergy, and said, we feel like one of the major issues our community needs to address is racial reconciliation. There'd been a group of folks connected with the March for Jesus who had reached out to the African American community who had said, well, we'll march with you for Jesus if you will talk with us about racial reconciliation. And they had the courage to do that, and out of that, a Christian Pastors Fellowship formed, which continues to this day. A couple of churches, Sterling Lands and I, had been getting together to do some racial reconciliation work between our congregations, and Sterling wrote a letter to the mayor asking him to make this a front burner issue in our community. So the mayor called the clergy together and said, I agree, this is an issue that's very important among us. You remember some of the rancor with the council election that year in particular. But that's just one incident of a number of concerns that have been expressed by the minority community in Austin. And the mayor gathered us and said that he believed that it was an issue we needed to deal with, but that it was a moral and spiritual issue, so he needed the leadership of the clergy in that regard. And this is a group of clergy that have stayed connected with each other and have continued to address this and intend to continue to address this as long as we're here.
The issue then has created community between clergy of East Austin, clergy from Central Austin, and from the various sectors of the city over this issue. And what are they about? How are they addressing this issue? You have the support of the government, you have the support of the city, of the mayor's office, but how are they going about addressing this issue, and then how are they going to implement it? By the way, I also think it's interesting that there would be the March for Jesus group, would bring up this and lift this up, because I think that's commendable that those people are saying we're not only going to march up Congress Avenue, but we're also going to be able to do that with our brothers and sisters of color.
One of the exciting things about this movement is that it has gathered some folks in churches across some lines that we do not often connect with. Liberal and conservative, and I'm not sure any of these labels apply too well, but churches that are not often involved in ecumenical efforts have connected with those that do on this issue, because all of us see that it's a significant moral issue. Beyond the Christian clergy that have gathered, we've reached out and created an interfaith base of clergy and religious leaders who are participating with us, because in their own traditions they also recognize the need for racial reconciliation.
For there to be that idea of racial reconciliation, there needs first of all to be an acknowledgement that there is racism, that it is a part of our, I think you said, our people's story, our history as a people. How do these clergy go about recognizing racism within themselves? Now, it's one thing to be able to say, there's racism out there. But what have they done, the clergy, to recognize that, first of all, they have to address the racism within themselves and within their faith tradition, and then begin to do some of the work of penance, if you will?
Well, that's right. We put together a statement about a year and a half ago now, a commitment to racial reconciliation that expressed our concern about the issue here in Austin. It was not received well, but by the wider community. I think it was misunderstood. The heart of that document was a recognition that racism exists, and that the place where we have to start is with ourselves. We felt like we cannot have a prophetic voice in the Austin community if we're not dealing with this issue within our own hearts, within our congregations, and between our congregations. So one of our first commitments has been to build relationship with one another. In a Christian context, we talk about the gospel, the good news. But there's bad news that precedes that. In the issue of racism, there's bad news. We have a history and a continuing racism that we need to address. But there's good news, that it is possible to act in positive ways, not just to address the pain of the past, but to have hope for the future by tearing down those walls, understanding one another, celebrating our differences and our ethnicity, and building positive relationship. And we intend to do that. We do feel like we have a responsibility to have a prophetic voice as spiritual leaders in the community, to call the whole community to this kind of racial reconciliation. But if we're not doing it, we don't have the moral integrity or the moral freedom to call others to do it too.
You mentioned individual clergy approached the mayor. The mayor then called upon clergy throughout the community to gather and talk about this and make this part of the agenda in their leadership of the community and of their individual faith communities. Then these clergy came together. What has that been like? You've been a leader. You've been a part of this. What was it like at the very beginning? Was it a feeling of awkwardness? You probably knew some of these clergy from other events, other ecumenical events, because you've been involved in the community at large. What was it like to begin to talk about one's racism, one's background? For instance, Larry Bethune, where were you raised? Are you a Texan?
I am a Texan. I grew up in Pearland in the Houston area. Went to Baylor University before I went out east for my education at Princeton Seminary. Came back to Texas to pastor. And I learned my racism not so much from my family as I did kind of from the society around me. I went to a church that was all white. In my school, there were very few minorities. In most cases, race coincided with class and class divisions as well. And it wasn't until later in life that I realized the racism within myself. And not even knowing everywhere that it came from, but realizing it was a part of the society in which I had been raised. In fact, I had always kind of considered myself not to be a racist and to care about all people, and I went to a seminar by a group called Stir Fry, in which...
Say that name again.
Stir Fry. It's out in California. And we went through some exercises where we sat face-to-face with people of a different ethnicity than our own and talked about our own attitudes and experiences of racism. And my eyes were open, not only to the racism within me, but to the experience of a broad group of people among us whom you and I, as white men, don't usually have to listen to. Race it's very rare for two white men in our society to have a conversation of concern about racism. And I think it's part of the solution to the problem to get the majority community talking about it as much as the minority community has to in order to survive in our society.
I think you also mentioned it takes the majority community and the minority community listening to one another to be able to recognize that we have something that we can learn and share with one another, and in that process to bring about reconciliation, which is our goal. Most recently, we saw the statue being erected to Dr. Martin Luther King.
That's right.
And I thought it was beautifully done, and I've taken the youth of our parish there, and I think that it's really a sign as King stands there looking towards the east and recognizing the invitation of the community to come, and like we did in our parish community with our children, our youth, to sit at his feet and to learn from one another and to learn from his dream and his vision. But that also means we have to be willing to be open to that.
Right. I had the honor of being at Riverside Church in New York City on MLK Sunday this year and listened to James Forbes, who is one of the premier preachers of the land, African American. And he made a great point. He said that 3 days a year, that weekend and that holiday, we hear Martin Luther King's wonderful voice saying, "I have a dream." You can't escape hearing that weekend. But we don't hear it so often the rest of the year. And there aren't as many people who are committed to making that dream a reality day by day. It's something that all of us need to take as a responsibility, as an opportunity. In my own experience of dealing with my own racism and in working in racial reconciliation, I've come to recognize how much less we are when we are not open to and connecting with people of other ethnicities, of other races, who are different from us, even of other religions.
Let's talk about that as we continue our discussion. And we're going to take a break, and we want you to stay with us on Austin Faith Dialogue, because I believe you can grow in being a challenging element within your faith community, to talk to your leadership, to invite all of them to be a part of this racial reconciliation, an exciting opportunity for all of us. Please stay with us on Austin Faith Dialogue. Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue. We're talking with Dr. Larry Bethune of University Baptist Church. Pastor Bethune is a leader in our community, and he is one of those clergy of our community who have been challenged and are challenging us to look at racial reconciliation. And we're inviting you and your faith communities, and we're inviting your clergy those to participate in this whole theme and effort and this moral experience of calling one another to racial reconciliation. Larry, just before the break, you talked about being in Martin Luther King weekend, being at Riverside Church in New York City. For those who are our viewing audience who've not been there, that's a magnificent structure, really an exciting place to worship. But it's a congregation also that has its struggles. And you've talked about your struggle, your recognition of racism within yourself. What about congregations? What can our congregations do? Let's use Riverside, which has a lot more resources than most of us do, but Riverside has to struggle, don't they? Riverside congregation.
Well, that's right. James Forbes is their first African-American pastor. And because he is there and because of his ministry and the outreach of the church, more of the minority population is coming up from Harlem, which is there in the neighborhood and participating in the church. When I was there, my wife and I participated in a panel discussion that members of Riverside had, talking on the topic of, is it possible to have an interracial congregation or only a congregation in transition, moving from being one ethnicity to another? And they wrestle with that. Martin Luther King said that the 11 o'clock hour on Sundays is the most segregated hour in the country. And I think to a degree that's still true. And there are reasons beyond racism for that. Spirituality is very deep. It's often ethnic in its quality. And it is not easy for people of different cultures, ethnicities, and races to worship together continually, because we've all developed different styles of spirituality. But it is possible. There are a number of congregations here in Austin that are multiracial. And those congregations that may be of a particular ethnicity can still connect with other congregations and other persons beyond the normal life and worship of their church for special occasions and continuing opportunities to build relationship.
Then where would you come down? Would you come down on it that it is possible for congregations to be multiracial? Or are we always in transition? Are congregations always going to be seeking and struggling and challenging and failing and then having good news? Is it possible to be one or the other, or are we always just there?
Well, I'll give you a good preacher's answer. Yes.
Okay.
As you know, every congregation is always in transition of some. We're on a spiritual journey, and we're always trying to address our spirituality and our message to the circumstance and situation of the moment. Particularly in this day and time where people move so frequently, our congregations are often changing in makeup, particularly my congregation, which is at a crossroads, one of the most heavily populated intersections here in the city. We've had an experience of multi-ethnic congregation for a number of years. The University Baptist Church voted to end segregated seating in 1948, which was very late by the standards of justice and human history, but very early in the history in this area of addressing racial integration and racial reconciliation. And from that time on, we have had not only African American, but Hispanic and Asian Americans and internationals who were students at University of Texas as active participants in our congregation. I don't think the goal of every congregation is to become multiracial, but I think the goal of every congregation needs to be to address racial reconciliation in our culture and in our society.
That's a very interesting distinction that you've just placed out there in front of us, all right? That the goal of every congregation does not have to be multiracial, but it does need to be, how did you say that? It does need to be open to...
Well, addressing racial reconciliation in their ministry and in their own personal lives.
Well, I want to talk about that. But first, before we do that, hold on to that, okay? I want to talk about that story you told me regarding the clergy, how the clergy came together to tell their stories. And you mentioned that white clergy, the majority clergy, if you will, of the community, got together in inner circle and talked about racism. And you tell the story because it was a great story.
Well, as I said, we felt like we have to address our own racism at the same time that we're trying to have some prophetic word to the community about addressing racial reconciliation. And so in our first meeting, we gathered to talk about the wounds of racism as it affects each of us personally, what our own stories and experiences have been. One of the exercises that we did was to sit in two circles with the white or majority community on the inner circle and the minority clergy on the outer circle. They listened while we talked about our experience of racism and the wounds that we feel like it's given to, that has given to us. And then we switched places and we listened while they talked about their own concerns and experience of racism.
And what were some of the stories they told? I think we can share those. What were some of the experiences that clergy of our community, those who proclaim God's kingdom, have gone through? What are some of the...
Almost every minority clergy member talked about some experience of being stopped by police for driving in the wrong neighborhood or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Almost none of the white clergy had ever had that kind of experience. A number of them talked about their concern for their children because they were attending schools that did not have the resources that other schools in the city had. They also talked about the pain of having to explain to their children racial slurs and remarks that white children had made towards them. Racism is something that the minority community has to deal with every day. We have the luxury of talking about it when we feel like it. But if our eyes are open to God's creation, we recognize that we are less unless all of God's children are at the table as equals and sharing their gifts. And they have great gifts to share with us. So racism wounds us as white people also.
We are less because we have cut ourselves off, and we are more when we interact with one another and learn from one another and share the great gifts that we can give to each other.
That's right.
What then can a congregation do? You mentioned about your congregation, and you have to be very grateful to serve in a congregation like that. That was ahead of the time, so to speak. What can congregations do in this whole process of sharing together in the theme of racial reconciliation?
I have a great congregation. It's impossible to be a prophet for very long without having a prophetic congregation that supports you. And University Baptist Church has been that for years before I even arrived. I think it's important for the issue of racial reconciliation to be addressed from the pulpit, that the clergy have the first responsibility to become aware of what the racial issues and divisions are within the community, to listen to their brothers and sisters of color, and to understand what their issues are. For years I would walk past the Black Studies section in the bookstore, and I love to browse at bookstores, but that didn't have anything to do with me. I've come to realize that it does have something to do with me, and that I need to hear the concerns of that community, to build personal friendships so that I'm aware of issues that I might otherwise ignore. Beyond that, congregations can talk to one another about that issue and connect with congregations of other ethnicities. A number of our congregations for years have had a Race Relations Sunday where we do a pulpit exchange, perhaps a choir exchange. But most of us in the clergy group feel like we need to move beyond that. That's good, but we need to move to a level of working together on common ministry projects, to sitting down with one another and having some of these conversations, which are painful because we have to deal with our own history, but which are also wonderful because they're the opportunity for us to build genuine, continuing relationships with people who are different.
Forgive me for interrupting, but I'm wondering, do you meet east of I-35, you know, we've got this great divide in our community.
Yes, we do.
Do you meet there, or are you always meeting at University Baptist?
Well, we're meeting regularly at University Baptist right now because it's a central location. And we're drawing folks from Manor, from South Austin and North Austin, and we have the parking, and the congregation is very glad to say, come and meet with us. But it's close to all of these neighborhoods, and we have, what's more important are the connections that we're trying to make between congregations and clergy from across the city, across faith divisions, across divisions within our faiths, and certainly across the lines of color.
We only have a couple more minutes, but I'd like to ask you, do you think we could pursue this conversation throughout the year 2000? Would you come back and maybe bring some of the people from the Racial Reconciliation Clergy Group and talk with us about how this is progressing and what is happening?
I am very grateful for your invitation to come tonight, and I know that others in the group would be eager to come and participate, and glad that we could have this conversation, but I think it's very important for us to include people that are representative of the whole group. And let me end by making an invitation, if I might, to all of the clergy of Austin to join us in the Austin Clergy Committed to Racial Reconciliation. It's a group of clergy from different faiths and different racial groups who are gathering to address the issue of racial reconciliation. And they can simply call me and I'll give them the information at University Baptist Church.
And you could also say you're connected with Austin Metropolitan Ministries, is that correct?
Austin Metropolitan Ministries is Pat Flood is a member of the executive team, and we are also connecting with the Council for Community Reconciliation, which is another show.
Mm-hmm. Let's do that. Let's do another show on this, all right?
I'll look
so
forward
down
to
the
that.
weeks, I'll be calling you and saying, Larry, bring some of that group of clergy and let's talk about racial reconciliation. And we thank you for being with us on Austin Faith Dialogue. This is an opportunity for you and for me as we begin this new year and as we move into a new decade to consider some of the opportunities that are ours, to bring together unity and bonding among the people of faith and all of the people in our community. It's a challenge, it's a little scary, but we can do this. We can do this because God is calling us to be the people of God in this day and in this time. Talk to your pastor, talk to your clergy. Invite them all to be with you and with us. Thanks to Larry Bethune. Thanks to the Austin Clergy for Racial Reconciliation. Stay with us again and visit with us on Austin Faith Dialogue. God be with you. Peace.